Pardon me?
Yeah, sure.
And watch for his new show on Fox Business, the #1 rated show on all of Fox Business.
Yeah.
All right, for David Barton, question from Erica. She writes, could you please explain the founders'
Is Erica
meaning?
that complicated a name?
Well, yeah, when it's spelled with an A.
Oh, okay.
I thought it
yeah.
was Africa for a second, but there was no F. A continent is writing to us? I don't understand. Okay. David Barton, could you please explain the founders' meaning of separation of church and state? This is a good question, and it comes up every time.
Separation of church and state is a phrase that had a...
Oh, wait, hold on.
We're not on? There we go.
There we go.
There we go. Separation of church and state is a phrase that had a really well-established historical meaning at the time the founders used it. It was not just a concocted phrase. It stayed established for 150 years after they used it, but very simply, it was that the Bible had created an institutional separation of church and state. You had Aaron over the spiritual stuff in the temple. You had Moses over the civil stuff. When King Uzziah tried to combine them, God whacked the king, and now I want the two institutions separate. But it got combined at about the 4th century A.D. And what happened was the government took over the church, and the government said, we'll determine theology, and you guys enforce what we tell you to do. It wasn't the church taking over the government. So what happened was we went about 12 centuries that way. We call it the Dark Ages. That's where all the atrocities occurred in the name of religion, particularly the Christian religion. And you get to a point in time where that you have dissenters popping up. About 30 folks over 7 nations, 250 years, said, no, we got to go back to what the Scriptures say. And that's the first guys to start pushing for separation of church and state. It really came to a head when Henry VIII in England wanted a divorce. The church said, no, not doctrine. You can't get divorced. He said, I'll start my own church and turn my own doctrines. At that point, Reverend Richard Hooker said, no, it's got to be a separation of church and state. You're the government. You don't determine church doctrine. So at that point, you had from England, 1580s, starting to come to America, people who had that view, that belief. The government is always trying to take over the church, not vice versa. So for the 150 years in America, separation of church and state meant the government can't stop us from doing a religious activity, determining our own theology, expressing ourselves, our faith the way we want. And that's the way the founders did in the First Amendment. Government cannot do anything to establish a federal religion, and government cannot do anything to stop religious exercises, period. When Jefferson wrote the famous letter, January the 1st, 1802, it was in response to a group of Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut, saying, we're the minority religion up here. We're afraid the government's going to stop us from expressing our faith. He said it won't happen. There's a wall of separation between church and state. So for 150 years after Jefferson's letter, separation meant the government could not stop a public religious activity. It changed in 1947, a judicial decision called Everson versus Board of Education. The court said, we think Jefferson screwed it up. Separation, he said, meant the government couldn't stop it. We think that it should mean that the church can't get involved in public stuff. And so at that point in time, we're now at the point where Congress shall make no law now means that a kid can't say the word God at a graduation, which is a stupid parsing of the Constitution and First Amendment. But that's the history of separation, church and state.
Obviously. 4th century A.D., obviously.
Guys should read a book or something sometime.
Jeez.
I mean, have some information. Come prepared.
I'm sorry. I struggle on this. I'm sorry.
We go over to David Buckner. Question from John in section F. If we are going to reach a bottom before we start seeing green shoots, what do you envision that bottom looking like?
If you're looking at the tools that are being used in order to get us out of where we are, one of the biggest challenges, I think, is inflation. I think the fact that and Glenn was talking about deflation. I mean, we're dealing right now with real issues where, as he started the entire premise of our discussion today, we don't know where it's going. Small businesses don't know how to invest. Large businesses don't know where to put their money. They don't know whether to hire people or not hire people because of where it's going to go. The fact that the Fed has been flooding the economy with cash, the concern I have is that you have the federal government selling treasuries, that's bonds, and the Fed standing on the other side saying, oh, we'll buy them, which means they're actually taking the loans from the government, flooding cash out there. How do you absorb that cash? You can't. So when the cash gets out there, prices have to go up. Here's the dirty little secret. If prices go up, governments make more money. So when we're talking about a bottom, one of the themes that seems to resonate among most economists and economic analysts is the potential for, if not the inevitability of inflation. And the real challenge is we don't get hyperinflation, because then we look at Argentina and Brazil of 1978 through 85, where currency is nothing but paper.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's another Dr. Doom scenario, right? I am a happy person.
This actually comes to us from Sonia, apparently listening over the internet, watching from Gilbert, Arizona. She says to David Barton, I haven't studied much about the founders, but when I watched the HBO series on John Adams, I noticed he and other founders spent a lot of time living in Europe. Why is that? Why would they work so hard for the freedom of the U.S. and then live abroad?
Because they were sent there by Congress. Congress sent them there. We actually needed a lot of help when we were an infant nation. We didn't have our own army, our own navy. We got a professional army. We're fighting. We're taking school teachers, and we're taking farmers, and we're taking shopkeepers. And so we need a lot of help from Europe. We needed to especially be recognized by Europe, because once we got recognition, we were able to get some loans in from Holland and other nations who thought that we weren't necessarily a bad risk when we started winning battles. So a lot of them lived there, and it's interesting. That really helped shape their perspective in a positive way. For example, when Jefferson, who had been a diplomat there, came home, and there was a lot of pressure 200 years ago, exactly what we see now, let's be like Europe. We want to do cap and trade like Europe, and we want health care like Europe, and we want all these things like Europe. When Jefferson, the first Secretary of State, heard that, and people said, we're a brand new nation, 10 years old, let's do what Europe's done. This is Jefferson's response. He said, the comparisons of our government with those of Europe is a comparison of heaven and hell. Exactly right. So what they saw in Europe reinforced to them what we had in America, that we did not want to be like Europe. Washington's farewell address I read part of, his last part was, remember, we're us, they're them, don't be like them if you want to stay us. It was real simple stuff.
So it wasn't that they just had hotter babes and better food at the time.
No, wasn't it?
All right.
Over to David Buckner. No, it could have been it. That's a good question, Pat. It was a good question.
At the time. Certainly not true now.
No, definitely not. Over to David Buckner. Everybody agrees now what we have now as a tax system is a complete disaster. But if you had to change it, if you were, an Obama-like dictator, if you were that person, would you prefer flat or fair tax reform? No tax. Someone yells no tax. Yes, we'd like that one best.
They're loaded. It's a loaded question, not loaded intentionally, but because of the way in which it's enacted. My biggest concern is the fact that you start with something very simple, and by the time it gets completed, we have thousands and thousands of pages. Yeah. I always joke with my students when teaching principles of accounting that, accountants truly do spend most of their time asking the question, what do you want it to be? The problem is there's so many loopholes. If you look back at some of the history, you go back 9 years from now to a fiasco that took place in your neck of the woods in Texas in a company called Enron. Most of what they did, folks, if you really look at it, what they did was technically, I have to say this gently because I'm going to get bombarded, technically legal but incredibly unethical. What I mean by that is all of the accounting practices, the off the balance sheet debt and the mark-to-market accounting and other things had been SEC approved. So when you look at this, our tax practices worry me more than the tax policy. If we could enforce something that is truly fair, and I'm not talking about standard, only the fair tax, but truly fair, the problem is then you define who says what's fair. Yeah. If you do truly flat, the question is okay, now are you alienating those that have to put food on the table at the bottom end? I'm not sure any form of taxation other than a consumption tax is something that which I can choose, rather than an investment tax, which should grow the business and the economy. We penalize people for investing, and we bless people for consuming. The issue is, if we want to charge somebody, charge them for consuming. They can choose to consume less. And that's where I'd put the emphasis and focus.
Yep. The problem is none of those solutions will ever happen because our government's being run by the D's Hamburger Clown now. And it's, if the D's Hamburger Clown is here, I apologize for insulting you that way. But, all right, we're running out of time, so we're going to squeeze in just a couple more questions for David Barton. I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit. It's somewhat long and very impassioned from Penny, who's talking about the indoctrination of her kids at school, which she has seen with her own eyes. And she is seeing that her kids are coming home believing that capitalism is a bad thing. Mm-hmm. And so she is wondering if you have a suggestion on resources to use in the home to teach our children from the time they're young and up through high school.
There are some good resources out there, and particularly the two areas of education that have started reclaiming some good stuff is in private education, Christian education, homeschool education. The curriculum is much more positive, much better. That's a reclaiming. The thing you have to do if you're going to stay in public education is you have to be willing to teach twice, because they're getting what they're getting in school, but when they get home, you're going to have to teach them the right stuff, which means you've got to learn the stuff. And so there's resources out there. The best ones I know of are actually reprints of old works. This is not new principles we're talking about. They're old principles. And so Google Books has some great stuff out there on history, on economics, on other stuff. I wouldn't read much of anything before 1900, because that's when it really started going wacky. But before 1900, after 1900. After 1900 is when it really, you had revisionists everywhere. But before 1900, virtually any book you read about America is going to be really good on economics, really good on faith, character, morality, history, government, etc. It's going to be good.
All right, one more question, last one for David Buckner. How does David Buckner get away with talking this way at Columbia?
Yeah.
This is really dangerous. At the expense of sounding somewhat favorable toward this fine institution, I've got to tell you the truth. They have been incredibly generous and kind over the years to support not only the idea that markets can be spoken of, and if you've noted today in most of my dialogue, I've not referred to political parties. I've not referred to isms. For when you refer to the markets and you talk about market economies and planned economies, the rules dictate the answers. Yeah. I've had a great chairman. This last year I received full professorship, adjunct full professorship, which was the first. For the specific program that I was in, and it was an honor to join 3 others in that area, and they have really given me full latitude to teach and allow students to think. So to be quite candid, it's a great institution that has really given a lot of opportunity, and that is in my own words. To the microphone right back there.
We want to thank David Buckner, David Barton.
Thanks, buddy.
Thanks, man.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.
See you guys.
Thank you. Thank you.